on the C-SPAN radio app.
Washington Journal continues.
As the federal government approaches the end of the fiscal year, we're joined by OpenTheBooks founder Adam Andrzejewski, joining us this morning to talk about their recent report. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning, Bill. Great to be on the program.
OpenTheBooks.com. Tell us about your organization.
Well, we launched on a national basis about 5 years ago. Here's our mission: to post every dime online in real time. To that end, last year, our auditors filed and followed up with 41,500 Freedom of Information Act requests. Our objective is to empower the regular American citizen with the information necessary to hold the government accountable for tax and spend decisions.
So you got involved in this. How? What's your background and your interest in federal spending?
So I'm a business guy, and back in 1997, my brother and I, from scratch, from our apartments, we founded a publishing company. We did yellow page telephone directories for small communities. And I had the blessings and good fortune 10 years later, 1 year before Steve Jobs invented the iPhone, to sell my shares. And it was at a multiple never to return, obviously. So then I got involved in public policy and politics. My father, as a conservative Democrat in 1976 and 1978, had run against one of the most powerful Illinois Republicans in history. Many people watching the program will know the name George Ryan. And George Ryan was eventually governor, and he was one of those Illinois governors that served time in the federal prison. Well, in 1976 and 78, I was in the second and the fourth grade, and my father instilled in me the nobility of public service when he ran against George Ryan for state representative. So after I sold shares in my company, I looked around for an idea, silver bullet, so to speak, to end the corruption, and I settled on this idea of transparency. Over the course of time, I met powerful people like former Senator Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, and we took our Illinois lessons on transparency writ large across the country.
And part of that transparency is the report your organization just issued, titled The Federal Government's Use It or Lose It Spending Spree, How the Federal Government Spent $91 Billion in September 2019. First of all, the terminology, you called it a spending spree. Why is it a spree?
So about 1 out of every $6 in contracts, for instance, at the Department of Defense, goes out the door in the final 30 days of the fiscal year. Here's how it works. Federal agencies, 67 of them, they spend down their budgets this year so they get the same or more money out of Congress next year. And Bill, it's a big problem when the federal agencies can't even spend all the money that Congress is throwing at them.
Your report says $91 billion in September 2019. And to be clear, September is, as we mentioned, the last month of the federal fiscal year anyway, ends at the end of September. Is that an unusual figure, $91 billion?
So it's up significantly from 2015. So Bill, we've been tracking this as an organization, doing oversight reports and auditing on this end of year spending spree since 2015. And back then it was about $69 billion. It had grown over the years to a peak in 2018 at $97 billion. And that's when I came on C-SPAN, and about a year and a half ago, we talked about this phenomenon. Last year, it ended up going a little bit backward, about $6 billion backwards to $91 billion. And I think it's because of the political pressure that all of us have put on this. For instance, in the president's budget to Congress in February of this year, in a new chapter on how to eliminate wasteful spending, he highlighted our oversight report and said it was a priority of the administration to stop this practice. Republican U.S. Senator from Iowa, Joni Ernst, a year ago, she wrote the legislation to stop this year-end spending spree. And even here on July 1st, in the House Armed Services Committee, the Democrat Adam Smith out of California, the powerful chairman of the Armed Services Committee on the National Defense Reauthorization Act, said we need to stop the use it or lose it spending at the Pentagon that goes on every single year. So there's bipartisan support for this measure now.
Let's open up our phone lines because we're starting to get lots of calls about this. Republicans, it's 2027-488-8001. Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents and others 202-748-8002. You can send us a text at 202-748-8003. And just to talk about the numbers in your report, the federal spending numbers, September of 2019, nearly $24 billion was spent in the final 2 business days of September last year. September 30th broke all records at $12.2 billion. September 27th recorded $11.6 billion and $51 billion during the last 9 days. On federal contracts, there were $91 billion spent on 642,000 transactions, an average of $31 billion on 21,418 transactions each day. And during a 2-year period, September 2018 and 2019, the spending totaled $188 billion. One more figure, too, because it's worthwhile noting you talked about defense. The biggest amount of money here spent is, in last year anyway, September last year, $690 million for guns, ammunition, and other weaponry. $457 million for public relations, marketing, research, public opinion, and advertising, and other expenses as well. Did any of that surprise you in terms of the amount they spent?
Look, the numbers are dizzying. It's a tremendous amount of money. And Bill, here's what everyone needs to understand. A lot of it was wasteful spending, just to spend down these budgets at the end of the year. But all of it was borrowed against our national debt. And as you know, now our national debt is rivaling $27 trillion.
All right, let's hear from Rob in hometown Illinois, Republican line. Good morning, Rob. Go ahead.
Good morning, Bill. Love C-SPAN. Good morning, Adam. Love perusing your OpenTheBooks.com website. Very interesting.
Thank you very much.
My question is about a controversial state rep from the state of Minnesota, Ilhan Omar. It seems a lot of stories are swirling around her financing. I was wondering, is she doing anything a little fishy with her campaign contributions or whatnot? Thanks.
So specific to use it or lose it spending, our investigation didn't cross with individual members of Congress. It only crossed on the policy, on the legislation, like Joni Ernst's legislation out of the Senate, which was also picked up by Dan Crenshaw as a companion bill in the House. So there is a bill to stop use it or lose it spending in the House and the Senate. The White House guy is committed to it, and the powerful Democratic chairman, Adam Smith, and the Armed Services Committee said he'll back it as well.
If they adopt it, though, it might put you out of business in terms of this annual report you do for September spending.
Well, hey, that would be a great thing. That would be a great thing. Here's what we found this year at the Department of Defense. Last year, it made national news on your program, Bill, when we discovered $4.6 million was spent on lobster tail and snow crab in the final month of the fiscal year. And then the Pentagon admitted they spent $25 million on lobster tail over the course of an 18-month period. This year, the numbers on the lobster tail and the snow crab are actually the same. It's $4.6 million. The distribution of what was spent on lobster versus the crab are much different, though. This year, we're choosing to highlight the $88 million spent by the Pentagon on public relations. Last year, they spent $1 million on PBR, the Professional Bull Riders Association, and this year they just spent a lot of money overall on general advertising for the United States military, including $33,000 spent on specific contracts on social media to promote their air and water shows.
Our D's next in Okeechobee, Florida, Democrats line.
Yes. Hey, about this fiscal year spending, this gentleman is totally correct. Absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with what he said. I used to work for the school, elementary school, back in the early 90s. And coming at the end of the year, okay, I'm talking about schools now, okay? He never mentioned schools when he was talking to you, but these actually go along to all the schools in this country also. You know, teachers are all the time out there wanting more money because they're on strike or whatever, okay? But during the end of that year, I happened to be there, and I'm going to tell you something. They had thrown out thousands and thousands of books, desks, you name it. I mean, we had to go and clean and pull everything out because they had to spend the extra money that they had left over. And we're talking multitude of things that they got rid of, okay? Desks, you name it. They threw everything out, okay, so they can get more, because if you spend all your money for that year, you get more the following year. So every year they keep adding more and more and more to their budgets because this is what's happening in the schools. And this is in the early 90s.
All right, D. Adam Andrzejewski.
So, that's an experience that we hear about at every level of government across the entire country. Last year, coming onto C-SPAN, we took 17 calls. There were a lot of callers that complained about what's going on use it or lose it end of year spending in their local municipal governments, in their school districts. People from that work in state government had called in. We heard last year from somebody that had worked in Coronado, California for Special Forces and Seabees for 23 years. And he said it was criminal what was going on at the Department of Defense in end of year spending. So this is a common refrain, unfortunately, from many units of government across the country, and public executives at all levels need to crack down on this.
Are all federal agencies, are their budgets end of fiscal year, they have to spend that money, or does some of that spending carry over into the next fiscal year?
Well, there are certain agencies like the Department of Justice, like Transportation. They get they get some flexibility, Bill. They get to carry over 50%. They don't get to carry all of it over, but they get to carry half of it over, 50% of what they don't spend. So, for example, across all federal agencies, end of year spending on IT infrastructure is about 12% on the year. However, at the Department of Justice, it's only 3% on the year, in part because they have this carryover provision. So there are interesting public policy fixes that can be brought to bear. This is what Mac Thornberry, the Republican ranking member on the Armed Services Committee, right, and Adam Smith, the powerful chairman, they wanted to get this amendment in for the Department of Defense so they could carry over 50%. Very reasonable, and unfortunately, it did not go into that bill this year.
All right, let's hear from Sabrina, Asheville, North Carolina.
Hi, I was wondering if you could give me some advice. I am concerned about how much money is being taken by the child support system and is unaccounted for. I kind of feel like they're robbing the American people because they're taking the federal income tax returns from the lower income levels, and they're taking all of the poor's money and putting it directly into the government system. And I was wondering if you had any advice to me on how I can possibly get them to stop doing that. How can I get them
in terms of that specific situation? I'm unfamiliar with the details on that. But just generally, what I'd like to say is all of these examples of waste, whether it's the end of year spending spree, every single dollar that's wasted on stand-up desks, lobster tail and snow crab, public relations, the purchase of unnecessary and unneeded vehicles to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars at the end of the year, every single one of those dollars is a dollar that can't be spent on somebody that has true needs. And that's why I think it's incumbent on all of us to raise our voices on a bipartisan basis and say enough's enough. Stop Christmas in September for federal contractors.
A viewer in Provincetown, Massachusetts, with a question saying, didn't the Grace Commission address this same problem years ago? Do you think you would gain more traction if you focus not just on Congress, but on grant recipients at the state level as well?
So that's a great question, and the Grace Commission probably did address this. This end-of-year spending spree has been going on for decades. Our organization, we're proud to say, has made this front and center over the last number of years, and now there's some bipartisan agreement to stop this thing. I do think that it's important to bring the heat to Congress because they write the rules, they can crack down. However, the caller has a point that the vendors are also culpable. Look, we took a look at the top 3 vendors last year. They're all defense contractors. It's Boeing, United Technologies, and so Boeing, United, the top 3 contractors, they spent $175 million on lobbying last year. It's a tremendous, over the course of a 5-year period that we studied, they spent $175 million lobbying Congress. And they took about $12 billion on use it or lose it spending at the end of the year. And so that was about 1 out of every $5 that went out the door in the last 30 days went to these 3 defense contractors who had spent a tremendous amount of money lobbying Congress over the course of the past 5 years.
And they topped the list of the top 10 federal contractors as September 2019. $22 billion, or 1 in every $4, goes to just 10 contractors. You mentioned Boeing, United Technologies, Lockheed Martin. We'll show you the rest on the screen as we go to our next call and hear from Paul in Indianapolis. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I was an auditor with the Department of Defense for like 25 years, and the whole 25 years, this problem continued. One of the biggest reasons for that is that the money goes from Congress down to a department like the Department of the Army. The Army splits it out, but the Army doesn't send all of its money down to its subordinates. It keeps back a percentage. And each level as you go down also keeps a little bit set back. So, but come time to the end of the year, they've got all of these reserves they've held for emergencies during the year that all of a sudden have to be spent. So they all get crammed down to the lowest level. And the lowest level has their wish list, and they haven't been able to fund those wish lists. They're ranked by priority. And so all of a sudden, their 4 levels of bosses are all of a sudden just raining money down the tree, and then they just start picking their off their wish list. Probably the best way to solve this is to take a look at have somebody review the wish list, so that there's nothing on the wish list that you don't really need. Because there are a lot of times, like I think the third number there was furniture. A lot of times furniture in an office that hasn't been replaced for 50 years, that's way down on the priority list. Come time at the end of the year when all the reserves are being held or are being dispersed, or not dispersed, obligated rather.
Yeah.
They need to buy those. That's their chance to buy that furniture. And so that's why you always see furniture jump right up, because it's always low priority until they have too much money. So I would that's probably one good way to control. You're always going to have this problem because they're required to keep reserves at each level, and all those reserves have to be liquidated by the end of the year.
Paul, appreciate your input and expertise on this. Adam Andrzejewski, your thoughts?
Well, it's a refrain that we do here, especially at the Pentagon, especially at the Department of Defense. In the Armed Services Committee hearing on July 1st, Republican Congressman from California, Paul Cook, he's a retired Marine officer. He said that it's criminal. He said that he participated in it when he was in the Marine Corps as an officer. And he said he said, quote unquote, I'll probably burn in hell for this. And he says nobody stopped it, and it has to be stopped. Look, Bill, in the data that we reviewed, about 1 out of every 6, 1 out of every 7 contracts that the Pentagon lets on the year goes out the door in the last 30 days. And I'll submit to you that there's no way to run the finest military in the world. And I would feel a lot better about all of their spending if the Pentagon could simply pass their audit. The last audit, they've only had 2 audits. The Trump administration mandated the Pentagon have an audit. By law, they were supposed to have an audit since 1990. So for the past 2 years, they have flunked their audit. 1,400 auditors spend 12 months. The audit costs $1 billion, and the Pentagon flunks it.
You've mentioned this bill by Senator Joni Ernst a couple of times. The name of the bill, the End of Fiscal Responsibility Act, would limit agency spending in the last 2 months of fiscal year to no more than what it usually spends every month on average. It would limit only applies to discretionary spending, and examples exempts entitlement payments like Social Security and Medicare and national security related expenditures. Where does this stand in the Senate? You mentioned also there's a companion version by Dan Crenshaw of Texas. Where's that measure?
So the bills haven't been moved. So there's only about 6 or 7 sponsors in the United States Senate. and the bills haven't been called for markups in the committee and things like that. Look, this is probably a 99% issue with the American people. The Ernst bill is very reasonable. You can't spend more in the last 2 months of the year than an average of the last 10 months. I can't come up with a more reasonable bill that in the early years of this would stop this blow-off excess spending spree. It's good legislation. It should be picked up and it should be considered.
All right, let's go to our Democrats line. Carolyn in Mount Vernon, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to say that when President Obama was in office, we saw the debt clock on C-SPAN every day. And now that this president that is in office now, the debt is 3 times when President Obama was in there. We never see the debt clock. And I also like to say, please have Dr. Joy DeGruy on, who can speak to race relations. Thank you.
Adam Andrzejewski, do you want to address
Yes.
the mounting debt?
Yeah, I mean, the last 3 presidents have not performed well on spending and debt issues. For instance, George W. Bush, he took over, I think the national debt was about $4.6 trillion. By the time he left office and turned it over to Barack Obama, it was up a little over $9 trillion, almost $10 trillion. And then when President Obama left office, it was up at about $19 trillion. Now, after 4 years of the Trump administration, we're up approaching $27 trillion. So presidents in the last number of years, they have not performed well on spending and debt issues.
Our guest, Adam Andrzejewski, is the founder and CEO of OpenTheBooks.com. We're talking about their report, their latest report on end-of-year spending, very end-of-year spending. Welcome your calls and comments at 202-748-8001 for Republicans, Democrats 202-748-8000. Independents and others, 202-748-8002. Part of that debt, Adam Andrzejewski, because of the significant spending in response to the pandemic, a report here at NextGov, the headline says the GAO, more than half of COVID-19 government contracts are not competitively awarded. They say that the ongoing pandemic has led to a surge of spending among federal agencies, particularly those with health and emergency response missions. As of June 11th, the agencies spent upward of $17.8 billion, much of which was not awarded through full and open competition. Your thoughts?
Well, it's a great study. And furthermore, that's what we feel happens on the end of year spending spree. I mean, just think about this. Per day, there's over 21,000 contract transactions being executed in the federal agencies. Those can't be done on a frugal basis. Those terms can't be tight. This can't be getting a fair shake for the United States taxpayer. It's too much money going out the door too quickly. And there's a lot of different things the federal agencies can do. Like one of the largest offenders this year and amongst the federal agencies was the General Services Administration, the GSA. They do rank and file purchases that can be used by bureaucrats across the board in many federal agencies. They could use the latest in technology. I'm talking about a Dutch auction, a reverse auction, where amongst qualified bidders, the terms of the contract go up. And qualified bidders on an online auction on a very transparent basis, they're able to bid down the costs of rank and file goods and services. So like the $300 billion spent on clothing, that can be Dutch auctioned. You've got a lot of vehicles and transportation. There was $250 million worth of vehicles that were purchased last year. That can be put up for a Dutch auction. You have many, like food items. There was $500 million worth of food items. Those things can be put up for Dutch auction. The savings out of that technology can rival 40%.
All right, let's go to George, Jacksonville, Florida, Republican line. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thanks, Adam, for being on the local show here at Dean on a regular basis. I'm an engineer. I've had some medical training, et cetera. And I found that our power company and other power companies around the country have changed their smart meters, electric meters, 3 times. These are radio meters, and they cause health problems. We complain about it, and they put another one, the same kind, on it. It costs billions of dollars to change the meters and the software. And we could cut our health care costs in half if we got rid of the radio type, which hurt people. Plus, there's a complimentary thing for doctors, and it's been approved by the FDA. Use it, which uses the same technology with good frequencies. I'm just really upset at how Congress doesn't seem to have the ability to work through these things and find out what the best choice is.
Well, that's for sure. Congress needs to get back to its auditing function. And so here's another area, like, for instance, healthcare costs. Medicaid and Medicare last year admitted that they improperly and mistakenly paid out $85 billion. $67 billion of that was overpayments. The 20 largest federal agencies last year admit that they mistakenly and improperly paid out $1 billion to dead people. There was $10 billion mistakenly paid out on Social Security. Incredibly, in the Social Security database, there are 6 million active Social Security numbers of people aged 112 and over. Here's the problem. There's only 40 of those people alive in the entire world. So there's a lot of waste in the federal government. You know, what federal agency is running well? I cannot point to one.
All right, we go to Brian in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. Independent line. Brian in Pottstown. I'm sorry, that's Tony in Tampa. Go ahead. Tony in Florida. Go ahead.
Hey, how you doing, gentlemen? I just wanted to say to Mr. Andrzejewski that, in your opinion, has Nancy Pelosi destroyed Trump on every budget that's been signed, including the shutdown? I mean, Trump's claiming that he's collecting all this money from tariffs and selling our oil all over the world, and NATO paying their fair share to Europeans. But when you see the way the debt has grown under this president, it's almost impossible to believe. And then there's printing money to boot. I just don't think he's done a good job at all with the spending. And when you look at it, we hired him to do two things: build a wall and get rid of Obamacare. And with the House and Senate for 2 years and the amount of money he spent, to be bragging about 300 miles of wall, which 197 of it was rebuilt, I vote for the guy, and I'm just saying, I don't see him as the smashing success all my friends and a lot of Trump supporters see him as.
Okay, Tony.
Well, I think your characterization of the first 2 years of the administration is spot on. If you remember, it was Paul Ryan in the House, Mitch McConnell in the Senate, and President Trump. And those budgets that the president signed, spiked the national debt. We were running $1 trillion national debt ahead of the pandemic during boom times. And I was on C-SPAN, and I was issuing the debt and spending warning on C-SPAN back last fall and previous to that. So we see it the same way on debt and spending issues. Specific to Nancy Pelosi, she always wants to spend more than what the Republican Senate wants to spend. So I think that's where you have the tension. For instance, on her coronavirus bailout bills, the CARES Act, she came in with $3 trillion, and it was a 3,000-page bill. Mitch McConnell came in with a lot less, with about a 900-page bill. They kind of settled in the middle for $2.3 trillion worth of bailout. And a lot of those bailouts, on what they decided unanimously, nobody voted against it in either chamber. The president signed it, and a lot of those bailouts went to people that had no business getting a coronavirus bailout, including the wealthiest colleges and universities, the 25 largest colleges and universities with the biggest endowments, $1/3 of $1 trillion in endowments. They stood to reap $1 billion in coronavirus bailout, and they didn't need it.
All right, we'll go to the independent line next, and here's Brian, Pottstown, Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
I'd like to give you guys an observation I had, and it's unfortunately back from the 70s, but I was charged with buying an oscilloscope because we had a piece of equipment that needed service. And I tried to buy it in late August, and Tektronix, which is a great company, the salesman said he couldn't, unless I really was in an emergency situation, he'd rather put it off till October because he had to deal with all the government units that were buying their equipment in September. And that was many, many years ago.
Well, your experience rings true. You know, on our research, we found that Veterans Affairs, and they were audited by the federal auditing agencies like the GAO. And in 2017, there was a facility in a rush to get the dollars out the door. They violated all the rules. There was no review. There was no approval and other types of things that need to go into these purchases. They bought a duplicate surgery robot. It was the 84th surgery robot at this VA medical facility, and the total cost on that was $2.3 million.
About 10 more minutes with our guest, the Adam Andrzejewski, the founder and CEO of OpenTheBooks.com. We're talking about their new report, the federal government's Use It or Lose It spending spree, how the federal government spent $91 billion in September 2019. The lines Republican 202-748-8001, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and Independents and others 202-748-8002. And on who gets the money, this figure from your report, $74 billion of that $91 billion was just 5 departments. Defense, $57.5 billion. HHS, $5.75, Veterans Affairs, $3.8 billion, the GSA, the General Services Administration, $3.6, and Homeland Security, $3.5. Rob is in New York City, Democrats line. Good morning. Rob in New York City, go ahead, you're on the air.
Yes, hey, good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. Can you hear me all right?
We can, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, great. You know, we hired this so-called businessman, and he had the virus didn't hit until his 4th year in office. He had 3 years to straighten out the debt and the deficit, and nothing happened with building infrastructure, roads and bridges. It was all lip service. And as far as I'm concerned, that the virus didn't hit for the 4th year. They spend more on Secret Service. I remember they wanted to crucify Clinton for a haircut where the Air Force One had to land in Los Angeles, and it cost. The Republicans were saying how much gasoline that it used. And, you know, he's a fraudulent businessman. He leased out his name on buildings in New York City. He's not the businessman that he's pretending to being. And by the way, you know, he could not legitimately manage a giant healthcare crisis. But what he could do was to pretend that he could manage a giant healthcare crisis. And by pretending to manage the government and to handle the coronavirus, the virus became much worse. It became much, much worse. And he's still pretending that he's managing. He rehearses how he's going to pretend to be managing.
All right, Rob in New York City. Adam Andrzejewski, any thoughts?
So I think that's over the course of the next 65 days, that'll all be worked out at the ballot box. Here's our view at OpenTheBooks.com. We're a public charity. There's an iron wall between public policy and politics with us. We don't engage in the campaign. But both sides on this issue of excess blow-off year-end spending, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, should be able to get together on this. Look, at Health and Human Services, their largest expenditure was $120 billion on public relations. I think that's wrong. I mean, that drives people crazy. That's using our tax dollars from taxpayers to convince taxpayers to spend even more taxpayer money on larger budgets next year. Look, at HHS, here's an expenditure we are trying to get to the bottom of, and they've been unresponsive. We noticed in September of last year, towards the end of the year, they spent $32 million on a all-hazard ventilator stockpile. We want to know whether those ventilators were ever delivered for $32 million. And so far, we've heard crickets.
Question for you on Twitter from Bobby, who asked this: is all end-of-the-year spending considered wasteful?
No, I mean, look, the military spends money on missiles and ships and vessels, and it's not wasteful. Here's another thing they spent money on. They spent $1 million on black coffee. And it was General Patton that said during World War II that he could not fight the World War without black coffee. And so that's probably $1 million at the Pentagon in the war agency spent on coffee. It's probably well spent.
Keyport, New Jersey, next up. Pat is on the Republican line.
Hi. I heard you're faulting President Trump for a $1 trillion deficit when he came into office. But isn't the federal budget basically on automatic pilot? You can't even flatline spending. That, just use a number, say an agency spent $1 billion this year. You say we're going to give you $1 billion next year. They'll say that's a cut because you're not keeping up with inflation. How do we control spending that way? Thank you.
So in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, with the Republican Congress and Paul Ryan in the House, where the appropriations bills come from, they took all of the Obama administration's discretionary spending and they put it on steroids. They added $320 billion to Obama-era spending. So we didn't, tax revenues, people castigate the president for the tax cut. But what happened? We've taken a look at the revenues. Revenues actually rose after the tax cut, but spending went out of control on a bipartisan basis. So we don't have a tax problem. We actually have a massive spending problem. And that obviously after the pandemic, it should be obvious to everybody that we're just spending a tremendous amount of money that we don't have. We're borrowing and bonding our future generations to pay for this spending, and it's not morally right.
And that pandemic spending now at $3.6 trillion or so. So what's the solution? How do we bounce back from that? How do we pay down the debt after that kind of spending?
So look, this is a big problem. And so, we during boom times, when they were adding $1 trillion a year, we said, what happens when we hit a crisis? Now we've hit the crisis. So I think the first thing is you need to take a look after $3.6 trillion thrown at the problem. Let the money work through the system. There's a lot of this money that's been allocated and hasn't even been spent yet. So let this money work its way through the system. Secondly, everybody that doesn't need the bailout should give the money back. We partnered at OpenTheBooks.com with USA Today. We did an 1,800-word expose of wealthy hospitals, nonprofits that were receiving coronavirus bailouts that had massive endowments. We've talked about the colleges and universities with the third of $1 trillion in endowments that were allocated $1 billion worth of coronavirus bailout, and they didn't need it. You've got arts institution like the Met in New York City with a massive endowment. They don't need a bailout. You've got the mega loans of the Paycheck Protection Program between $1 and $10 million. We mapped all that by zip code and made the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal for that map. And we called out, for instance, Kanye West. He says he's worth $1.4 billion, and his sneaker company received between $2 and $5 million of coronavirus bailout money. If you don't need the money, send it back to the Treasury, because we're borrowing and bonding future generations on the national debt.
All right, let's hear from Roger on the independent line in Lanai City, Michigan. Go ahead. Lanai City, Hawaii. What am I talking about? Go ahead, Roger. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I was calling to see if we could, as taxpayers, since it's our money being spent ridiculously, can we hire Mr. Adam here to go in and make the necessary cuts and changes and be a worker for us, the people who are paying all this money that's being spent?
Well, I appreciate that. Look, I think we need a forensic audit in every single federal agency. What's a forensic audit? It's deep, it's evidentiary, it follows the money, and it holds up in court. And where there is misspending, improper payments, mistaken payments, we need to claw them back on behalf of the hardworking American taxpayer.
Here's Mark next up, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Democrats line.
Yeah, hello, how you doing? Thanks for C-SPAN. Hello?
You're on the air. Go ahead, Mark.
Keep answering me back. Oh, okay. Anyway, it's very funny that the guy before me called and said, how can we hire your speaker to work for the government, and yet it was the perfect opportunity. I don't know if you guys went over his background or not. That was his chance to say, hey, I ran for governor and you guys didn't want me to work for you, where he got beat very badly. And when he was a Tea Party Rush Limbaugh guy, saying the government spends too much money and pointing out all these programs, which is true. There's always lots of money lost in there. But then,
okay. So I just want to cover that. So I did run for governor in Illinois, the Super Bowl of corruption in 2009 and 10. And it was my only run for office. I've since sworn off politics. But we actually did pretty well. I was endorsed by one of the greatest champions of freedom and liberty in the 20th century. He flew in from Poland. His name was Lech Wałęsa. He was the Nobel laureate in 1984, and he helped found Solidarity in Poland. So look, I ran against the best and the brightest in the Illinois Republican Party. We came within 5% of beating them. I lost, but I ran on two things: every dime online in real time, aggressive transparency, followed by forensic auditing. And we've taken those two ideas writ large on a national basis, and I think it's a solution. We believe that transparency will revolutionize United States public policy and politics, and you're hearing a little bit of that today on the program.
Adam Andrzejewski, the founder and CEO, OpenTheBooks.com, their new report. You can read that online at OpenTheBooks.com. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Bill.
More of your calls ahead. We're going to talk to you this morning, the remaining half hour, about the protests over the weekend, the violence that took place over the weekend, and your thoughts and recommendations and comments. 202-748-8001, the line for Republicans, Democrats, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and for independents and others, 202-748-8002.